When Hank Hill said that soccer was a communist plot, he wasn't just delivering one of his trademark grumpy one-liners. He was speaking to something much deeper, a cultural divide that cut straight through American life in the late 90s. To some, it was hilarious, just another episode where Hank struggled against change. But to others, it felt like a direct insult, a shot fired at a game loved by millions around the world. And that's why this one episode of King of the Hill still sparks debate to this day. King of the Hill wasn't like other animated shows of its time. While The Simpsons leaned into absurdity and South Park thrived on shock value, King of the Hill found its strength in something simpler: realism. The characters didn't live in a wacky cartoon universe. They lived in Arlen, Texas, a fictional town that felt like it could be anywhere in suburban America. The humor came not from slapstick or outrageous situations, but from the quiet struggles of everyday life. Bills, jobs, family disagreements, and community traditions. That's what made it stand out. When the show first aired in 1997, America was in the middle of cultural changes that were subtle but important. Sports were part of that picture. Football, baseball, and basketball ruled American households. Soccer, on the other hand, was seen by many as foreign, slow, and un-American. Of course, this wasn't entirely true. Soccer had been around in the States for decades, and kids everywhere played it in youth leagues. But in the eyes of many adults, especially in conservative small-town America, soccer represented something new, something imported, something suspicious. That tension fit perfectly into the world of Hank Hill. He was a man built on tradition, propane, barbecues, football, and lawn care. The very idea of soccer clashed with everything he understood about sports and masculinity. Football, in his mind, was about strength, teamwork, and American pride. Soccer, to Hank, it looked like chaos. Players running around endlessly, games ending in ties and rules that didn't make sense. The sport offended his worldview. And so, when the writers of King of the Hill decided to put Hank up against soccer in the episode Three Coaches and a Bobby, they weren't just making a comedy about a dad grumbling at his son's new hobby. They were creating a perfect cultural showdown. Hank represented a version of America that didn't want things to change, while soccer represented the growing reality of globalization, that the world's most popular sport was here, and it wasn't going away. The brilliance of the show is that it didn't turn Hank into a cartoon villain. Instead, it let his discomfort speak for itself. His disgust wasn't pure hatred. It was confusion. He genuinely didn't understand soccer. To him, it broke all the rules of what a real sport should be. That's why the episode resonated. Audiences laughed at Hank's stubbornness, but many also recognized that same stubbornness in their own communities or even in themselves. But there was another layer. By the late 90s, soccer had become tied up in questions of immigration and cultural identity. As the U.S. became more diverse, so too did its sports culture. Soccer, loved by immigrant families, started to grow. Hank's hostility tapped into a real national conversation. Was America ready to embrace something that wasn't traditionally American? Or would people cling harder to their old traditions? In this way, the soccer episode wasn't just about soccer. It was about America wrestling with change at the turn of the millennium. Hank Hill stood as the everyman, both lovable and frustrating, as he dug his heels in against a world moving just a little too fast for him, and that's the magic of King of the Hill. It could take something as simple as a dad coaching his son's soccer team and turn it into a reflection of a much bigger cultural story. By the time the episode aired, it was clear this wasn't just a funny cartoon. It was a mirror showing America exactly what it looked like when tradition met change, and neither side wanted to back down. The episode at the center of this debate is called Three Coaches and a Bobby. On the surface, it's a simple story. Bobby Hill, the awkward but good-natured son of Hank and Peggy, decides he wants to join a youth soccer team. What could be more ordinary than a kid trying out a new sport? But for Hank Hill, it's the beginning of a nightmare. The episode opens with Bobby searching for something to belong to. He's not athletic like his father, not confident like some of his classmates. Bobby has always been the odd one out, more interested in comedy routines and hobbies that confuse Hank than in sports or manly pursuits, so when Bobby shows enthusiasm for soccer, it's a big deal. He finally has something that makes him feel like part of a team. But that joy is immediately undercut by Hank's reaction. Hank doesn't just dislike soccer, he despises it. From the very beginning, he sees it as pointless. The running back and forth, the low scores, the possibility of ties, none of it makes sense to him. What kind of sport doesn't even let you use your hands? He growls. To Hank, soccer is a betrayal of what sports are supposed to be. And in a way, his rejection of soccer is also a rejection of Bobby. That's the emotional weight of the episode. Bobby finally feels like he's found something of his own, and his father can't accept it. The conflict escalates when Hank, against his better judgment, ends up coaching Bobby's team. On paper, this should be a wholesome father-son bonding opportunity. But instead of supporting Bobby, Hank tries to reshape the team into something closer to American football. He doesn't care about learning the rules of soccer or respecting the game on its own terms. He wants to impose his vision of real sports onto it. The kids, of course, are confused, and Bobby is stuck between his excitement for the game and his father's stubborn refusal to understand it. One of the funniest and most telling moments is when Hank tries to motivate the players by yelling football-style instructions, completely ignoring how soccer actually works. The comedy is sharp, but it's also tragic in its own way. Hank isn't just failing to coach, he's failing to connect with his son. He can't put aside his own biases long enough to see Bobby's happiness. What makes this setup so powerful is how ordinary it feels. Millions of kids in America have had the exact same experience, wanting to try something new, only to be met with skepticism or outright disapproval from their parents. The writers weren't just making fun of Hank. They were holding up a mirror to a generation of dads who felt threatened by change, by anything outside of their comfort zone. At the same time, Bobby's excitement for soccer represents something bigger. He's curious, open to the world beyond Arlen, Texas. He doesn't care if soccer isn't considered manly by his father's standards. He just wants to play. In that sense, Bobby stands for a younger, more globalized America, one that doesn't see soccer as strange, but as normal. And here's where the genius of the episode lies. It doesn't make Bobby completely right, and Hank completely wrong. Bobby, in his eagerness, sometimes ignores the reality of how much his father struggles with change. Hank, meanwhile, isn't portrayed as purely hateful, just deeply confused and defensive. That tension creates a story that's not only funny but painfully relatable. By the end of the episode, Hank's resistance hasn't completely softened, but the cracks begin to show. As much as he hates soccer, he can't entirely shut himself off from his son's enthusiasm. And Bobby, for all his independence, still wants his father's approval. The ending leaves viewers with a sense of unresolved conflict, because that's the truth of it. Some divides aren't neatly solved in 22 minutes, but that's what makes 3 Coaches and a Bobby so memorable. It isn't just an episode about soccer. It's an episode about the walls that exist between parents and children, about how traditions can both guide and limit us, and about how comedy can be the perfect lens for uncomfortable truths. What begins as a simple setup, Bobby joins a soccer team, becomes a story that perfectly captures the friction between old America and new America, and that setup was only the beginning. The real explosion came when audiences watched Hank square off against soccer and realized this wasn't just about one man's stubbornness. It was about a cultural divide playing out in living rooms across the country. What made this episode more than just a funny sitcom story was the way it tapped into a much bigger divide. Hank Hill versus soccer wasn't just about one dad disliking a sport. It was about America itself, caught between tradition and change. To understand Hank's hostility, you have to look at what he represents. Hank is a man built out of straight lines and clear rules. To him, the world makes sense when it's predictable. Propane tanks are filled to the proper level, lawns are mowed in neat rows, and football has 4 quarters that always end with a winner and a loser. Soccer, by comparison, looks like chaos. Players sprinting up and down endlessly, low scores that don't reflect the effort, matches that can end in ties. To Hank, this isn't just confusing, it feels wrong. It violates his sense of order. But beyond the rules, there's something deeper going on. Soccer was, and in many ways still is, seen by some Americans as foreign. It's a sport beloved across the globe, yet slow to be embraced in the United States. In the late 1990s, soccer carried the reputation of being tied to immigration, multiculturalism, and a global culture that many small-town Americans didn't quite recognize. Hank embodies that anxiety. His disgust for soccer is laced with fear. Fear that his own traditions, the things he grew up with, might be pushed aside by something new. The writers of King of the Hill were sharp enough to play this tension for both comedy and truth. When Hank calls soccer a commie game, it sounds ridiculous, but it's also an exaggerated version of what many real people were saying at the time. The sport was mocked as soft, un-American, even suspicious. By putting those words in Hank's mouth, the show wasn't inventing a joke. It was reflecting the attitudes that really existed in backyards, barbecues, and sports bars across the country. What makes this cultural divide so interesting is that Hank's position isn't entirely unrelatable. For someone raised on American football, soccer does look strange. The field seems huge, the rules less straightforward, the scoring unsatisfying. Hank's stubbornness is funny because it's familiar. It's the same kind of knee-jerk reaction anyone has when confronted with something outside of their comfort zone. And that's where the episode finds its depth. It doesn't make Hank a monster for hating soccer. It makes him human, on the other hand. Bobby's joy for soccer symbolizes a younger America, one that doesn't care about whether the sport is foreign or not. For him, it's just fun. He likes being part of a team, feeling the rush of running on the field and getting attention for something he's good at. Bobby doesn't see the politics. He doesn't see the cultural baggage. He just sees a game. In that sense, Bobby is everything Hank is not: open, curious, and ready to accept change without fear. This tension between Hank and Bobby mirrors the tension within America itself at the time. On one side, a generation raised to believe football, baseball, and basketball were the only real sports. On the other side, a new generation of kids signing up for soccer leagues in record numbers, growing up in a world where borders felt smaller and culture more connected. The clash was inevitable, and King of the Hill used Hank and Bobby to dramatize it in a way no other show dared. The beauty of the writing is that it lets both sides breathe. Hank is stubborn, yes, but he's also deeply invested in protecting his son from what he sees as nonsense. He doesn't hate Bobby, he just wants Bobby to share in the traditions that defined his own life. And Bobby, while eager to try something new, still longs for his father's approval. This isn't just a cultural divide between old America and new America. It's a personal divide between father and son, and that's why the episode works so well, because when Hank scoffs at soccer, he's not really scoffing at the sport. He's scoffing at the idea of a world that's moving beyond him, a world that doesn't play by his rules anymore. For audiences, that made the episode both hilarious and uncomfortable. We laughed at Hank's stubbornness, but we also recognized the truth in it. We knew people like Hank. Some of us even were hanked up by making Hank Hill the face of resistance to soccer. The show created more than just a sports rivalry. It created a cultural snapshot, a portrait of a country caught between the safety of tradition and the uncertainty of change. And through Hank's grumbles and Bobby's wide-eyed joy, we saw the growing pains of a nation trying to figure out who it wanted to be. Asterisk, when 3 Coaches and a Bobby first aired. It was just another episode in the second season of King of the Hill. At least, that's how it seemed on the surface. But almost instantly it struck a nerve. People weren't just laughing at Hank Hill's stubborn hatred of soccer. They were debating it. For some viewers, the episode was an instant classic, a sharp, hilarious look at a father struggling to understand his son in a world that felt like it was changing too quickly. For others, though, it felt like something uglier, a smug dismissal of a sport beloved by millions around the globe, and a reminder of how insular American culture could be. Part of the reason this episode hit so hard was timing. In the late 90s, soccer was starting to grow in the United States, but it was still fighting for acceptance. Kids were joining youth leagues in record numbers, thanks in part to the 1994 World Cup hosted in America. But mainstream sports media often mocked the game. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about players faking injuries, or about how boring a 1-0 scoreline seemed compared to the spectacle of the NFL. Against that backdrop, Hank Hill's rants didn't feel like satire to everyone. To soccer fans, they sounded like the same dismissive voices they were already tired of hearing. Online forums, which were beginning to blossom in that era, quickly picked up on the episode. Soccer enthusiasts accused the show of reinforcing negative stereotypes, while defenders argued that Hank wasn't meant to be right. He was meant to represent a narrow-minded view that the audience was supposed to laugh at. The tension between those two readings made the episode one of the most discussed in the show's early history, and it wasn't just soccer fans who had something to say. Parents related strongly to the story, but in divided ways. Some recognized themselves in Hank, admitting that they too didn't get soccer, and found comfort in seeing their own confusion turned into comedy. Others felt sympathy for Bobby, recalling the sting of wanting to try something new only to be shot down by their parents. The emotional resonance of the episode meant it was far more than just a sports joke. It was a mirror held up to families. Across America, the controversy also extended beyond casual fans. Critics noted that the episode cleverly disguised a cultural debate inside a family sitcom. By mocking Hank's refusal to learn the rules of soccer, the show was actually mocking America's refusal to engage with the wider world. To some critics, this was brilliant social satire. To others, it was mean-spirited, using a sport loved by immigrants and international communities as the punchline. The fact that both readings were possible only added fuel to the fire. Years later, as soccer's popularity in the U.S. steadily grew, the episode took on new life. Clips of Hank yelling about a game where they run around in shorts and it can end in a tie resurfaced on YouTube, sparking debates in the comments sections. Some viewers insisted the episode hadn't aged well, calling it proof of America's small-mindedness. Others defended it as timeless, arguing that Hank's cluelessness was the whole point. The discussion never really ended, it just kept evolving along with the sport's place in American culture. One of the most interesting parts of this legacy is how the episode became a meme. The phrase, "Hank Hill hates soccer," is now almost as iconic as some of his propane quotes. For fans of the show, it's shorthand for Hank's inability to cope with anything outside his comfort zone. For soccer fans, it's a badge of honor. Proof that their sport once ruffled so many feathers that even a mainstream TV show had to acknowledge it. The internet kept those jokes alive, ensuring that a 1990s sitcom storyline would remain part of sports discourse decades later. But beneath the memes and debates lies a deeper truth. This episode divided audiences because it hit too close to home. It wasn't just about whether people liked or disliked soccer. It was about how Americans viewed themselves in relation to the rest of the world. Was America ready to embrace something global, or would it keep clinging to its own traditions? Hank and Bobby's conflict made that question personal, forcing audiences to choose whether they laughed in recognition, cringed in discomfort, or both. That's why the controversy endures. Because Three Coaches and a Bobby wasn't really about soccer. It was about identity, belonging, and the growing pains of a country standing at the edge of cultural change. The laughter it sparked wasn't just about a dad yelling at a game he didn't understand. It was about the tension we all feel when the world shifts around us, and we're not sure if we're ready to shift with it.